Here is Tag Kyo no Oto Hisoku, a turquoise ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
Turquoise inks just aren't my thing, but at first I thought we might have a good one. Wrong for me. There is color variation by nib, and there is frequently shading, but this is a light turquoise tone that I think you would really be using for a turquoise to enjoy, and yet, I think you'd really have to be a fan of turquoise to enjoy, and yet I'm not a fan of turquoise, and I'm not a fan of this, and I don't, it's not horrible if you like light turquoise. It's just horrible for me. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with a fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub.
The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a nice mid-tone of the turquoise with no feathering, with no spread, with some shading that's going on rather nicely. If you look at and seam to on the second line, A is a little bit darker than the N and it darkens into the D again. Seamed starts light at the S, gets dark at the E's, lightens at the M, dark at the ED. So it's shading fairly well. The medium nib is lighter than it was with the extra fine. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It does shade very, very little, like the darker areas, ignoring the first H of hand where the pen sat for a day before I used it. But if you look at spiders, for instance, on the second line, the D is a little bit darker than the rest of the word. Just like with followed, the E is a little bit darker than the rest of the word. The followed was on the third line. I don't see the shading as anything particular stand out, and I see this as too light to comfortably read for a whole page. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, a little bit darker than it was with the extra fine. There is no feathering. There is no spread. There is the best shading that this ink is putting down. Every word has a constant shifting from darker to lighter tones, and this is the best it's going to look on any page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There's approximately 6 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We get almost nothing for shading. I say almost because look at the night on the second line. The is a little bit darker than night, and night starts lighter, works its way dark to the T. Could underneath that starts light and works its way darker to the D. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the extra fine, a tad bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some shading coming through. It is a turquoise after all. Some good shading does happen. Look at some on the first line, very light SOM, much darker ink, or ink E. Well, I'm wanting a darker ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, just a little lighter than it was with the extra fine. About the same tone, I think, as it was on the Clairfontaine. Very, very close to it. I'm looking at them side by side. There's no feathering. There is no spread. There is shading. Look at greener on the second line. The G has multiple tones in it. It lightens up into the R. Both the E's are quite dark, lightening into the NE and much darker at the R at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit lighter as a tone, but really showing off the turquoise color here with the tone of the paper. It's showing a turquoise with a little of a green lean, opposed to a little of a blue lean that it had. Now it has no feathering and it has no spread. It does shade. I think the shading shows up better here than it did on the previous paper. Look, it had a chance on the first line where the H is darker than the A in the beginning of the D, where that downstroke of the D much darker. The A is a nice midtone, and chance starts darker at the CH, lightens up at the AN, little lighter at the C, much darker at the E. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get a tone that's just it's too light, it's bad. It does shade. I don't want to continue looking at this though. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, about the same tone as it was with the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get very nice shading. Don't forget about that. Looking at forgot on the first line, the 4 is lighter than the G. O lightens up a little bit and the T gets quite a bit darker. No troubles at all looking at troubles on the second line, where the T is much darker than the ROU, and the BL get very dark where the ES lighten up quite a bit. Looking at the back of the page, we get no surprises with this light ink, with no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering and it has no spread. It has no ability to really stand out against this quad rule. It really blends in to what's going on. Now it does shade a light bit. Take a look at light on the third line, where the LI is a little bit darker than the GH and the T get a bit darker. It began to do some. When you look at began right next to it, the B is a little darker than the EGA, but the N gets quite a bit darker. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the extra fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading. I think the shading on this paper shows up a little bit nicer than it did on the Clairfontaine. It's not horrible. It's still not really standing out on the quad though, with it being that lighter tone. Don't use this on quad rule paper. Just save yourself. Looking at the stub nib, it is darker than it was with the medium, same tone as the extra fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering and we get no spread. We do get shading. Yes, we do. It's not as good as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it is still good. Take a look at these questions, they, on the first line. The T is a little bit darker than the Hess in the middle, where the E at the end gets quite a bit darker. Questions really shifts between mid and light tones back and forth quite a bit, where they at the end shows some nice mid and lighter tones at the E, mid tones at the TH, shows the dark tones at the top of the Y. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting. You could easily write back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diatramentis Document Turquoise. Here is Noodler's Dostoevsky. Here is Robert Oster Deep Sea.
Here is Thornton's turquoise.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is lighter and duller and less interesting than it was on the Clairfontaine. It has no feathering, it has no spread. There's very little shading, though some shading does come through here. This would be a bad choice for a student to use on this paper. I really feel like it would be hard to be checking your notes with it. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. I think the shading is showing up a little nicer than it did with the extra fine here. It's hopefully to be expected considering it's a broader nib. Take a look at expected him on the second line. The cross of the X does show as much darker. Now the EXP is lighter than the E, and the C into T is very light, where the T is very dark, ED mid-tones lightening up. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, as the extra fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread, we get shading nowhere near as good as we had on the Clairfontaine, about as good as we had with the medium. Still is not standing out against this quad rule. It's really drowning here on the paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting, no surprises considering this is a really light turquoise.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Jeherban Orange Indian. Here is Noodler's Pasternak. Here is Pilot Namiki Black. Here is Cross Red.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get some feathering and we do get some spread. Takes it almost up to a medium, almost. The feathering's not out of control. There is some shading, sort of like the H and though on the second line, but I wouldn't be counting on this for shading. It's serviceable. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine on this paper, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. We do get feathering and we do get spread, not any worse than we had with the extra fine. Still leaves this as a serviceable ink on this paper. There is the shading shows, I think, a little bit nicer or a little more pronounced when it does happen. So yes, there is a little bit there, but you kind of have to look for it. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium and the extra fine on this paper, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Yes, it still feathers. Yes, it still spreads. Yet, I think the feathering and the spread here are better than it was with the extra fine or the medium. Now, it does shade, sort of, little bits, kind of little spots, easier to spot than it was with the extra fine or with the medium. Really, I wouldn't count on it for shading here. Still serviceable on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, now the ink gets quite deep into the paper, so I wouldn't write on the back of the page, but it is copy paper after all. I can't read it on the other side, but I'm still going to say there's some heavy ghosting because of how deep that ink gets in there. But nothing bled through to the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper. The extra fine gives a nice mid-tone with a decent amount of shading. The medium is sadly often lighter and doesn't shade as well. Maybe it's because the flow is the same as the extra fine, but it spreads out more. But the stub goes against that as it is darker than both the extra fine and the medium, and they all have the same feed. It still does shade well, maybe the best of them. So now I choose a stub, but a stub with a slightly wetter than normal feed to help darken this ink a tad. Otherwise, it's an ink that I would use as a second color on the page to add to my notes.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.